Chapter 673. Warning. Warning. There is a strong fluctuation in the binding force field. Warning. Warning. The pressure in the combustion chamber is rising rapidly. Warning. Warning. The cooling system has failed. Warning. Warning. The heat shielding system has collapsed. Warning. Warning. The elemental furnace is shaking violently. Please stop the operation immediately. Forceful stop program activated. Forceful decompression and cooling system activated. A series of sharp and ear-piercing alarms sounded in the room. Sulen, Hathaway, Alex, and the others' faces suddenly changed, and they quickly activated the backup method. Space isolation system activated. Energy shield activated. Soft decompression and buffer spell activated. As Hathaway gave the order, a space barrier immediately rose in the half-plane, dividing the half-plane into two spaces. Then, in the half-plane where the elemental furnace was operating, an energy shield quickly rose, and at the same time, a large amount of aqua-blue liquid was constantly filling it. This aqua-blue liquid was a special buffer liquid that Hathaway and many other wizards made, and it could absorb the shock wave of the explosion to the maximum extent. Warning. Warning. The forceful stop program has failed. Warning. Warning. The forceful decompression and cooling system has failed. Warning. Warning. The pressure in the elemental furnace is rising rapidly, approaching the critical value. It is estimated to explode in 7 seconds, please prepare for defense. 6, 5, 4, Sulen and the others did not care about anything else, and they all activated their spells. Now, the energy wave above the elemental furnace had exceeded that of a level 10 spell. Although Hathaway and the others had done hundreds of calculations and prepared various defensive measures before the experiment, they still did not dare to be the slightest bit careless when the elemental furnace exploded. 3, 2, 1. Rumble. A dazzling light instantly erupted from the elemental furnace, and a huge mushroom cloud rose from the half-plane. Violent energy completely erupted at this moment, and flames as high as hundreds of thousands of degrees swept across the entire half-plane at this moment. At the core of the explosion, the intensity of the light could reach thousands of times that of the sun. Such a strong light could blind human eyes in an instant. The high temperature of the explosion directly vaporized the ground, and a huge crater appeared on the ground. The ground cracked under the pressure, and the sand on the ground melted into a glass-like state under the terrifying high temperature. The shockwave that swept through everything destroyed everything in its path. The powerful impact hit the protective barrier. At this moment, the protective barrier was like a bubble, bursting open with a bang. After the shockwave broke through an energy barrier, it continued to move forward, shattering one energy barrier after another. All defensive spells were like paper in front of this shockwave. Finally, after breaking through a dozen defensive spells, it hit the blue buffer liquid. The buffer liquid kept churning under the influence of the shockwave before quickly evaporating. It only took a few seconds for the buffer liquid to completely evaporate. The explosion brought a tyrannical power that destroyed the defensive measures Hathaway and the others had set up in advance. The entire demiplane was swept away by the shockwave, and a layer of the demiplane's ground was fiercely scraped by the shockwave. After the shockwave broke through all the defensive barriers, it fiercely hit the spatial barrier. Then, that powerful shockwave started spreading in all directions. But before that shockwave dissipated, an even more powerful shockwave surged over. One after another, the shockwaves kept bombarding the demiplane's spatial barrier. The narrow demiplane made these shockwaves bounce back and forth, but the shockwaves kept being generated until the entire half-plane was filled with shockwaves. The entire demiplane was like a cork blocking the mouth of a volcano. Under the influence of this powerful force, the originally hard space barrier began to loosen under the impact. The planar barrier began to slowly expand outwards, and the speed of expansion was getting faster and faster. Under the continuous impact of the powerful shockwaves, the planar barrier was forcibly squeezed and expanded. The entire half-plane looked like it had reached the end of the world. The ground was fragmented by the shockwaves, and cracks appeared on the spatial barrier due to the rapid expansion. The demiplane was on the verge of collapse from that explosion. It looked like the demiplane would have been destroyed if the power had been just a bit stronger. Fortunately, Sulen and Hathaway's previous arrangements had some effect and weakened the power of the explosion. Although the spatial barrier was on the verge of collapse, it was still stable. At the same time, the demiplane's elemental forge's explosive peak finally passed. After the peak, the power of the shockwaves started to slowly decrease. The shockwaves started to weaken, and the flames caused by the explosion also started to slowly decrease, but the temperature of the demiplane was still extremely shocking. "What's the situation in the demiplane now?" Sulen asked. The explosion just now directly destroyed all the monitoring equipment and detection runic arrays in the demiplane. Even the part of the space that was separated by the spatial barrier in advance was destroyed in the explosion. After all, the spatial barrier that was temporarily separated wasn't very strong. Under such circumstances, it only lasted for a while before completely collapsing. However, even if it only lasted for a while, a large amount of information was collected. This information was immediately transmitted to the Tower of the North Wind's astrology platform. According to our calculations, it will take at least 3 to 5 days for the demiplane to calm down. As for entering again, it will take at least a month. The shock waves caused by the explosion destroyed everything in the demiplane. The ground shattered, the water evaporated, and the dust was completely raised and covered the entire demiplane. This dust will continue to float above the demiplane for at least half a year. The most serious thing is the magic energy pollution caused by the explosion. This kind of pollution will cause serious harm to living things. If this pollution isn't cleaned up, it will exist for at least 30 years. Judging from the energy produced by the explosion, a large amount of the spatial barrier has been shattered. It is very likely that a spatial storm will appear in the plane. However, this is also a good thing. The creation of a spatial storm can help us clean up the pollution faster. Although this experiment failed, we still gained a lot of benefits. Chapter 674. The impact of the explosion expanded the demiplane by 5 times. In addition to the expansion caused by the input of energy from the elemental furnace, the entire demiplane is now 7 or 8 times larger than before. As long as the magic energy pollution is removed, this demiplane can be used as a logistics base for the floating city. Hathaway said with a smile. Those spatial rifts still need to be repaired. With the pollution, we won't be able to use this demiplane for the time being. Sulen shook his head. At this moment, Chris suddenly said, I have an idea. Oh, what idea? Sulen asked with some interest. Although this demiplane is polluted and has spatial storms, and although ordinary people can't survive, there are still other creatures that can. At the very least, the high-level demons of the abyss can, Chrissy explained. The environment in the abyss was very bad. Sulen had been there before, so he naturally knew that the environment in the abyss was even worse than the demiplane's current situation. Since demons could live in the bottomless abyss, they would naturally be able to live in this demiplane. Of course, ordinary demons can't survive in this environment, so our target is the high-grade demons. With my current ability, I can enslave about 10 high-grade demons. Chris nodded. This is indeed a good idea. Moreover, these demons are quite strong and have some spell-like abilities. It's very feasible to use them to repair the demiplane. Hathaway, Alex, how many high-grade demons can you enslave? Sulen asked directly. I can enslave about 5, Hathaway said. I can enslave 3. Alex was a bit embarrassed. That's 18 in total. Not bad. Su Len nodded. I can probably enslave 24 high-grade demons in total. The demiplane's area is now 10 times larger than before. It's about 10 kilometers in radius. The area isn't too big. 24 high-grade demons should be enough. Then let's do that. Su Len decided after some consideration. By the way, Hathaway, summarize the cause of the explosion as soon as possible. Although the experiment failed, we still gained a lot from it. When the elemental fusion furnace is operating at 80% capacity, its operation is still very stable. Of course, there are still many shortcomings, but I believe that with the experience of this failure, it won't take long for us to successfully create a real elemental fusion furnace. I will. Although this experiment failed in the end, looking at the overall situation, there is no problem with our train of thought. I believe that after a few more experiments, we will succeed. Hathaway said with a smile. How many more tests do we need? Su Len shook his head. We've spent almost 2 million kinars worth of materials on this experiment. If we do it a few more times, I'm afraid that North Town City will go bankrupt. Hee, don't worry. The explosion happened because it was the first time. It's normal for this kind of problem to occur. But with this experience, we will pay more attention to the next experiment. Hathaway said with a smile. They were a little guilty of directly exploding 2 million kinars worth of materials in one experiment. Moreover, these 2 million kinars worth of materials were only the materials for the elemental furnace. The various defensive runic matrices in the demiplane were still there. Repairing the demiplane would require at least another 2 million kinars worth of funds. If they really exploded 2 to 3 million kinars worth of materials in each experiment, even if they had a mountain of gold, they wouldn't be able to keep up with the consumption. In the next few experiments, apart from spending a lot of money and materials to remake the elemental furnace, as long as they were careful, there wouldn't be any more explosions. The next experiments would be to improve these elemental furnaces. The top-quality lava crystal that Su Len obtained last time was an important material for making the elemental furnace. Although the temperature in the elemental furnace could reach tens of millions of degrees, and even steel would be vaporized in an instant, the elemental furnace could withstand such high temperatures without being damaged. Of course, the elemental furnace wouldn't directly withstand such high temperatures. As far as Su Len knew, there was no metal that could withstand such high temperatures. The elemental furnace didn't directly withstand such high temperatures. There was a combustion chamber inside the elemental furnace, and the elemental fuel was ignited in the combustion chamber. This combustion chamber cooperated with the energy binding force field to bind the elemental fuel undergoing the elemental fission reaction in a space. This was equivalent to a small sun. The energy released by the elemental fission would be collected and converted by the energy conversion runic matrices next to it. Then, the energy would be transmitted through the elemental energy channel. In fact, the theoretical knowledge of the elemental furnace had been completed long ago. The difficulty lay in the materials. Although they didn't need materials that could withstand the high temperatures of tens of millions of degrees, the materials that could be used to make the combustion chamber were still very precious. In addition to the materials, there was also the runic magic matrices. The materials needed for the energy-binding magic matrices were also very precious. It had to be known that the energy-binding magic matrices needed to bind an astonishing amount of energy. After the elemental fuel underwent the fission reaction, the energy released every minute could reach the level of a level 9 spell or even higher. If the energy-binding magic matrices didn't have enough power to bind such energy, it would cause the small sun to go out of control. A large amount of energy would directly rush out of the combustion chamber, and the combustion chamber would be destroyed by the high temperature in an instant. After the combustion chamber was destroyed, the other parts of the elemental furnace wouldn't be able to withstand such high temperatures. As a result, the elemental furnace would directly explode like the previous experimental body. The materials needed to make the energy-binding magic matrices were very precious. It required more than a dozen high-quality magic gems. At the same time, it also needed orichalcum, mithril, and other metals. In general, such an energy-binding magic matrices required 300,000 to 500,000 kinnar. After many simulation experiments, Hathaway finally made such an energy-binding magic matrices. But this time, there were still some problems and needed to be improved. However, this time, the energy-binding magic matrices could reach more than 80% power. There weren't many things that needed to be changed. In fact, the elemental furnace that Su Len and Hathaway were going to make was slightly higher than the standard from the beginning of the design. This way, even if the elemental furnace could only reach 90% power, it would be practical. Chapter 675. The failure of the elemental fusion furnace experiment did not affect Northern Town at all. Other than Su Len and a few others, no one knew about this experiment. The explosion in the half-plane did not affect other places at all. Although the demi-plane was riddled with holes, Northgard City was still prosperous. The morning sun dispersed the mist that covered the city, and the Pearl of the northern region woke up. As soon as Su Luan got up, Angela and Anna brought over the breakfast they had prepared earlier. There was a delicate fruit salad, a large piece of ham sandwich, and a piece of roasted meat with tantalizing aroma. You'll get tired of eating these things every day, no matter how delicious they are. Su Luan picked up the breakfast and tasted it. Su Len said as he ate, "When we have time, I'll ask Frodo to make spicy soup, tofu pudding, fried dough sticks, and steamed dumplings." Su Len had not tasted these things for more than 10 years, and he suddenly wanted to try them again. After Su Luan finished breakfast and went out, other people in the Wizard Tower were already busy in an orderly manner. Because the palace in the North City had been demolished, Su Luan had now moved to the North Wind Tower to live. Although the North Wind Tower was not as big as the palace, it had many advantages. The rooms were close to each other, so it was convenient for him to visit at night. If he was in the mood, he could go to the rooms of Chris, Hathaway, and Karina. After breakfast, Su Len did not go to the lab directly. Instead, he went to the Northwind Academy. The Northwind Academy had recruited more than 10 wandering wizards with good conditions. Most of them were intermediate to low-ranking wizards. As for high-ranking wizards, it was very unlikely. After all, most high-ranking wizards would choose to join a wizard organization or establish a wizard family. Compared to low-ranking wizards, high-ranking wizards would spend a lot of time on all kinds of experiments. These experiments required a lot of magic materials, and it would take a lot of time for them to gather all the materials for their experiments. Wandering adepts had to spend a lot of time collecting materials, or earn a lot of money to buy materials. As a result, wandering adepts didn't have much time to conduct experiments. As a result, their strength, knowledge, and other aspects were far behind the Academy adepts. Although the low-ranking wizards recruited by the Northwind Tower were not very powerful, they were more than enough to teach apprentices. Finally, Hathaway and Alex did not have to take out some time to teach them every month. There were thousands of apprentices in the Northwind Academy. Of course, according to the normal rate of promotion, about 60% of them would become rank 1 wizards, and the rest could only be apprentices. The resources of the Sorcerer Academy were limited. It was impossible for them to provide everything to all the apprentice sorcerers. Also, due to the problem of their own aptitude, those apprentice sorcerers would need 5 or even 10 times more resources to become an official sorcerer than a sorcerer with good aptitude. Just like any other Sorcerer Academy or Sorcerer Organization, the Northwind Academy was a sorcerer organization. The Sorcerer Academy would not provide all the resources that the apprentice sorcerers needed. Instead, the apprentice sorcerers needed to do all kinds of work in exchange for those resources, even knowledge. It was not easy to become a wizard. In addition to their own efforts, other knowledge, luck, and so on were indispensable. Although the North Wind Academy had only been established for a few years, with the support of the North Wind Tower and Su Luan, it had developed very quickly. Looking at the numerous wizard apprentices rushing through the academy, Su Luan's heart was surging with excitement. He looked at these people as if he was looking at a group of green leaks. These wizard apprentices would be an important labor force in the floating city in the future. The floating city was in the era of the Arcane Empire, and it was also the crystallization of the wizard's highest wisdom. A large number of wizards would be required to exert its full power. There were a lot of jobs in the floating city that needed them. Although the tower spirit was very intelligent and could help Su Len control the entire floating city, the cost of a tower spirit was too high. Even Su Len could not make hundreds of tower spirits to work in the floating city. Perhaps in the legendary Nirvana mechanical mirror, there was such a huge city that was completely controlled by the tower spirit. The Nirvana mechanical mirror was said to be a world created by the great arcanists of the Arcane Empire. This world was a magical plane. The residents were all kinds of golems and other construct creatures. In addition to these construct creatures, there were also the Fermi ants. These creatures were not friendly to outsiders. Legend had it that the floating city of the Arcane Empire was preserved in the Nirvana mechanical mirror. The entire mechanical plane had a golem factory, which could produce all kinds of golem constructs. However, since the destruction of the Arcane Empire, the Nirvana mechanical mirror had been closed. Until now, no one had been to that world. Sullen's design of the floating city would have 50,000 to 100,000 people living in it, including at least 3,000 wizards. As far as the current situation was concerned, there was a big shortage of wizards. However, with the North Wind Academy, as long as it lasted for 10 or 20 years, these wizards would eventually be gathered. After patrolling around the North Wind Academy, Su Len returned to the North Wind Tower. In the astrology platform, Hathaway's fingers shook slightly, and a flash of light flashed in an instant. Then, a three-dimensional image appeared in front of everyone. This is the first phase model of the floating city. In our plan, this city will have a perfect ecological system that can simulate the environment in the main material plane to the greatest extent. It includes a life support system, an air circulation system, a water circulation system, and an elemental balance system. The life circulation system is used to transform the waste produced in the floating city into various nutrients and other substances to maintain the growth of other creatures in the floating city. The air circulation system is composed of 12 air cabins and 6 conversion rune matrices. They can purify, transform, and decompose the air to release the air that ordinary people need. At the same time, it is connected to the outside of the wind elemental plane. This place can provide us with sufficient air. The water circulation system is composed of 3 artificial lakes. The artificial lakes will be equipped with purification systems to purify all kinds of water into harmless and drinkable water. Of course, drinking water is still different from drinking water. In addition, we have also opened a water elemental channel to obtain water from the water elemental plane. The elemental balance system is used to balance the 4 major elements in the floating city so that the 4 major elements maintain balance. There will not be too many elements that affect the balance and eventually lead to the collapse of the elements. Chapter 676. On the long table, Hathaway unfolded the parts of the floating city one by one and showed them to the other high-grade wizards of the Tower of North Wind. The construction of a floating city required hundreds of thousands of parts. It required a lot of manpower. A group of wizards from the Tower of North Wind surrounded the 3D model that Hathaway showed them. Andre touched his monocle and said, "I can make the water element circulation system." As a wizard with the legendary bloodline of a water demon, Andre's control of water elements was the strongest under the legendary level. He was the most suitable person to make the water element circulation system. But I still need some special materials to make the water element circulation system. The water element purification system was not a very advanced technology. Many wizard organizations had this technology, but it still needed some precious materials, such as a high-quality water element crystal core. Normal water element crystal cores could be used to make a small water element circulation system, but the large water element circulation system used in the floating city required at least a high-grade water element crystal core. A water element crystal core of this quality could only be obtained by going to the water element plane. "I need to go to the water element plane," said Andre. "Do you need me to send someone with you?" Andre shook his head and said, "No need. My bloodline allows me to be like a fish in water in the water element plane. Other people will only slow me down." "All right then." Sulen nodded and said, "Leave the air circulation system to me." Seeing that the water element system was taken over by Andre, Alex said. As a legendary figure who had divinity and mastered the law of the wind element, making the air circulation system was a piece of cake for Alex. With her strength, it was not a problem for her to go to the wind element plane or open up an elemental tunnel later. "Leave the life circulation system to me," Hathaway said when she saw that both the air and water circulation systems were being made. Sulen looked at Hathaway with surprise and said, "You're in charge of the elemental furnace and you still have time to deal with the life circulation system?" "It's okay. The elemental furnace is already half completed. The rest of the work is not much. Just leave the life circulation system to me," Hathaway said with a smile. "All right then." Seeing Hathaway's insistence, Sulen nodded and agreed. Sulen and Hathaway did not talk about the life cycle system in detail. This life cycle system was a bit special. Sulen and Hathaway needed the wisdom tree to carry it out. This circulation system was only owned by a few wizard organizations, and Suren and Hathaway were only thinking of an alternative. Other than these, the elemental balance system was much simpler. He only needed to build an elemental pool, and then set the critical points of various elements in the elemental pool. If there was more to be extracted and less to be replenished, it would be fine. Other than the fact that the elemental pool was a little expensive to build, there was no other difficulty. "Since the tasks have been assigned, we'll wait for you to finish them. As long as you don't take more than 2 years, it'll be fine," Sulen said in a deep voice. It would take a long time to build the floating city. Even if they directly used the North Town city to modify it, it would take at least a few years. Therefore, they were not in a hurry to install these supporting systems. As for the other things, let's distribute them for construction. There were still a lot of things to do in the floating city. Sulen only arranged a part of it this time. In the blink of an eye, more than a month had passed. During this time, Hathaway carried out another experiment with the elemental furnace. With the experience from last time, these elemental furnaces did not explode. Of course, there were still some problems, and this experiment ended up consuming hundreds of thousands of kinnar. The elemental furnace was constantly being perfected. Sulen, Hathaway, and Chrissy also began to summon demons. Demonology was a very important subject in the wizard school. Wizards had done a lot of research on demons. After all, demons were, in a strict sense, on the same level as the angels created by the gods. Demons also had a powerful ability to evolve. The original form of the Tana demon was just a soul worm. This kind of creature could be stomped to death by a normal person. However, after countless battles, this soul worm could grow into a powerful Baylor demon. From the weakest existence all the way to a powerful legendary demon, it was simply incredible. In addition to the powerful ability to evolve, demons also had divinity. Of course, it was different from the divinity of the gods. The divinity of demons was chaotic, depraved, and so on. Many of the demigod liches extracted divinity from these demons. Demons were essentially soul creatures. Wizards were very interested in demons, especially this kind of evolutionary genetic chain. Many wizards were very envious of this kind of evolutionary ability. They wanted to have this ability, but so far, no one had succeeded. The research of these wizards was not without results. Demon warlocks and enslaving demons were all invented by them. In a special laboratory in the North Wind Tower, there was a tall altar in the center of the laboratory. There were a lot of strange symbols around the altar, and there was blood smeared on the side. A corpse was lying on its back. There was a dagger in the corpse's heart, and a lot of blood was flowing out from the heart. The whole altar looked gloomy and horrible, and it made people feel a chill in their hearts. This was the altar where Sulen and Hathaway were summoning demons. It was not easy to summon a high-grade demon. Sulen sent a few death row prisoners from the death row prison, and then used them to summon demons. As a light rose from Hathaway's body, a chaotic, twisted, and evil power appeared on the altar. Blood flowed on the ground, and the surrounding walls were carved with various demon reliefs. These demons looked ferocious and horrible, but they were lifelike. It seemed that they would come to life in the next second. The special corpse oil candles burned quietly. After the light flashed, a strong negative energy quickly appeared. Then, all the candles turned dark red. Evil, resentful, and chaotic whispers suddenly appeared. These were the whispers of the demons. At the same time, it was also called blasphemy by the church's priests. Sulen and Hathaway stared at the altar. As the evil and chaotic energy continued to grow, it finally rose to the top. Then, a strong spatial wave came, and a dark red portal appeared on top of the altar. In the next second, a tall figure went through the portal. "Who is summoning the Almighty?" Bang! Sulen's body flashed and appeared on the altar in an instant. Without saying a word, he punched the demon with his big fist and directly hammered it down. "Cut the crap and get ready for the next one." Chapter 677. Who dares to attack the great? The Baler roared. It wanted to resist, but its huge body was pressed to the ground by a foot. It couldn't move at all. "Shut up." Sulen slapped the Baler. The powerful force made the Baler dizzy. Hathaway smiled and walked forward. She waved her staff quickly. A light flashed and instantly went into the Baler's body. A silver magic chain slowly appeared on the Baler's body. After seeing this chain, Sulen let go of his foot. The Baler that was struggling jumped up and was about to slash down. However, as soon as it moved, the silver rune chain on its body flashed. The Baler that was about to attack stiffened. Ah! With a painful roar, the Baler fell to the ground in pain. What happened? Damn it, you want to control me. Don't even think about it. Even if I die, I won't give in to you despicable wizards. The Baler roared angrily after noticing the strange state of its body. Half an hour passed. "Master, what can I do for you?" The 3-meter-tall Baler tried to shrink his body and half-bowed to Sulen with a fawning look. After a few days, Sulen, Hathaway, Alex, and Chris finally enslaved more than 20 high-grade demons. These high-rank fiends included Balers, Glabrizu, Six-Armed Snake Fiend, Soul Judgment Fiend, and other high-rank fiends. After completing the enslavement, Sulen and the others went to the demiplane again. The impact of the last big explosion hadn't dissipated, and the entire demiplane still had various traces of destruction. In order to protect this demiplane and prevent the demiplane from completely collapsing, Sulen and Hathaway reinforced the demiplane after the explosion. As soon as Sulen entered the half-plane, he felt that the pollution index here was off the charts. The explosion of the elemental fusion furnace was very powerful, even though Hathaway had tried her best to weaken it. However, the aftermath of the explosion still caused serious damage to the place. Sulen clicked his tongue when he saw the scene in the half-plane. It was no wonder that such experiments were prohibited in the material plane since the era of the Arcane Empire. What a terrifying force! Hathaway exclaimed in surprise when she saw the demiplane. The dilapidated scene before his eyes was like a world that was about to be destroyed. This half-plane could no longer be seen in its original form. However, even though it had become dilapidated, the danger inside had not decreased in the slightest. The destruction of the half-plane left behind countless spatial cracks. These spatial cracks were equivalent to the power of the primordial slashes. It was equivalent to a high-tier spell. Moreover, many of the spatial cracks didn't have any abnormalities. If one wasn't strong enough, they would be directly dismembered by these spatial cracks. This is really troublesome. The pollution here will take at least 100 years to dissipate. It seems that we have to clean it up. I don't know if more than 20 high demons are enough. Su Len looked at the half-plane in front of him and had a headache. Should we go and enslave a few more high demons? Su Len found that these high demons were quite easy to enslave. He could summon them and beat them up without saying a word. After that, he could enslave them. If they dared to resist, there was no problem. He could just beat them up again. If they dared to resist, he could beat them up again. These high demons were wretched. He had to teach them a few good lessons before they became obedient. The strength of these high demons was not bad. Although they had not reached the legendary level, they were almost at the 4th grade. Although the environment in front of them was harsh, they could still survive. You guys will clean up and repair this half-plane. I'll give you some things in a while to clean up the pollution here and repair those spatial cracks. Hearing Su Len's words, these abyssal demons quickly nodded in agreement. They were very well behaved. By the way, there might be some violent elemental lifeforms in here. Su Len suddenly said. The half-plane originally had connecting channels to the 4 major elemental planes. Although they were closed at that time, there was a high chance that such a strong explosion would have broken these channels open. In this way, it was very likely that elemental lifeforms would enter here. Elemental lifeforms were originally neutral, but in this chaotic and polluted environment, there was a high chance that they would be polluted and become violent. This kind of high-intensity pollution energy was very harmful. Elemental energy would be disturbed. These are purifiers. Spray these purifiers all over the half-plane. Su Len took out the potion in a wooden bucket and said, "You need to spray this once a day in this half-plane. If you dare to slack off, humph, you know the consequences." Su Len snorted at the high demons in front of him. These high demons were all brainless things. They would not know how to work if he did not teach them a lesson. The purifiers prepared by Su Len were specially used to clean up pollution. However, the effect was average. It was fine for light pollution, but for this level of pollution, the effect was very limited. They could only spray continuously and dilute the pollution bit by bit. Boom! A fireball fell from the sky. Su Luen didn't even look at it. With a backhand slap, he scattered the fireball. It's a large fire elemental. Hathaway's figure sounded. Not far away, a burning flame appeared. This fire elemental looked rough and tough. Its upper body was a burning flame, and its lower body was somewhat like 2 legs. The originally bright flame had become a little dim, and there were a lot of sparks jumping around it. It looked quite violent and aggressive. Something delivered to my doorstep. Seeing this giant fire elemental, Su Len's eyes lit up, and he rushed over directly. The Thunder God's spear also appeared in his hand. Rumble. There was a violent explosion, and the surroundings were completely turned into a sea of fire. However, this sea of fire was quickly extinguished. Su Len's tall body walked out of the sea of fire, and he tossed a fist-sized red crystal up and down in his hand. My luck isn't bad. What a good start. A high-grade elemental core dropped right away. Su Len put away the elemental core with satisfaction. This kind of thing was somewhat similar to a soul crystal. It could also be used to make the soul core of a magic statue. Such an elemental core could be used to make a set of steel magic statues. However, not all elemental lifeforms would drop elemental cores. The drop rate was about 30%. Chapter 678. Su Len was also very happy to see the elemental cores drop. No one would complain about having too many elemental cores and soul crystals. With the golem factory, Su Len would never have enough elemental cores and soul crystals. After seeing the elemental cores drop, Su Len's interest was clearly piqued. After ordering the high demons to repair the plane, he directly started cleaning up the berserk elements in the demi-plane. Most of the berserk elements in the demi-plane were wind and fire elements. The number of earth elements was very small, and there was basically not a single water element. This was mainly caused by the explosion of the elemental furnace. The explosion caused serious damage to the earth, and the water source directly evaporated. Therefore, without water elements, earth elements also became very rare. The berserk elementals were very aggressive. After seeing Su Len, they immediately pounced on him, wanting to kill him. But these giant berserk elementals were only at the 4th rank at most, and the gap between them and Su Len was too big. The lightning spear swept across, and the berserk wind elementals' bodies collapsed and dissipated in an instant. With a soft clang, a fist-sized wind elemental core fell to the ground. Su Len gently waved his hand, and the wind elemental core directly flew into his palm. With a burst of crackling lightning, the wind elemental core returned to silence. In fact, there was a big difference between using an elemental core to make a golem and using a soul crystal to make a golem. Earth elemental cores were heavy and were more suitable for making stone golems, such as obsidian golems. Of course, it was also possible to make steel golems. Golems made with earth elemental cores would have defensive bonuses, but their speed would be correspondingly slower. Golems made of wind elemental crystal cores would be more agile and would have a corresponding increase in speed, but their defense would be slightly worse than other golems. Golems made of fire elemental crystal cores would have an increase in attack power, especially when it came to fire spells. But at the same time, their defense would be weakened. Golems made with water elemental cores could change their form, but the effect was limited. At the same time, their attributes would be more balanced. There were a lot of berserk elementals. Su Len found some spatial cracks in the demi-plane that connected to the elemental planes. After all, when the demi-plane was first established, Su Len had connected it to the elemental planes, allowing the demi-plane to obtain the elemental energy of the 4 elemental planes and rapidly grow. Thus, Su Len's demi-plane was actually quite close to the 4 elemental planes. When the elemental furnace exploded, the power of the explosion tore through the spatial cracks and connected to the elemental planes. Many of the elementals in the demi-plane came here through these spatial cracks. The space barrier itself had the ability to repair itself. However, this self-repair ability was not very high. If the damage was too severe, it might take thousands or even tens of thousands of years to repair according to its self-repair ability. Although the demi-plane looked quite miserable at first, Su Len and Hathaway had done a lot of protection before, so the real damage was not too serious. The spatial cracks that connected to the elemental planes had shrunk a lot, and such giant elementals could no longer pass through. Su Len set up a runic magic array around these spatial cracks to seal them again and speed up their recovery. The other spatial cracks also needed to be repaired, but these spatial cracks were more difficult to repair. Apart from the spatial rifts that connected to the elemental planes, the rest of the spatial rifts were basically spatial storms. These spatial storms were very destructive. If one were to accidentally fall into one of these spatial storms and not be able to escape in time, even a legendary powerhouse would fall. In the exploration of the astral plane, apart from encountering some powerful enemies, evil gods, abominations, and other monsters, the most dangerous thing was to be involved in a spatial storm. The power of spatial storms varied, and they erupted very suddenly. Once one was involved, it was basically equivalent to being attacked by at least the disintegration spell at all times. If the spacetime storm was very strong, then the attack would be equivalent to the Great Disintegration spell, and even legendary powerhouses would not be able to withstand it. Moreover, this dissociation also had the effect of cracking. If one was not careful, all their luxurious equipment would be reduced to dregs. Su Lin was still very cautious about these spatial cracks, because this was only a spatial storm caused by the spatial cracks, and its power was limited. At most, it was only equivalent to the sixth circle spell dissociation. Su Lin could directly resist this level of spell with his body. Next, Su Lin and Hathaway began to repair these elemental cracks. Su Lin directly blocked the spatial cracks with his tyrannical body, blocking the spatial storms inside. Then, Hathaway set up a runic magic array around the spatial cracks. With Su Lin blocking the spatial cracks, the surrounding spatial storms naturally dissipated. Without the interference of these spatial storms, the speed of setting up the runic magic array was naturally much faster. Soon, a runic magic array was completed, and Su Lin left the spatial cracks. He saw that the raging spatial storms outside the spatial cracks had appeared again, and were rushing towards the cracks. However, as soon as they touched the spatial cracks, they were blocked by a transparent shield. Without the interference of the spatial storms, the spatial cracks began to recover faster. The spatial cracks that would have taken at least 5 or 6 years to recover now only took a little more than a year. Su Lin and Hathaway cleaned up the berserk elementals while sealing the spatial cracks. At the same time, they also commanded the high-rank demons to clean up the pollution of the demi-plane. They became very busy for a while. After spending 3 days, the berserk elementals in the demi-plane were finally cleaned up. Their luck was pretty good. After cleaning up all the berserk elementals, Su Lin obtained a total of more than 30 elemental cores. These elemental cores were basically large pieces, and only a few were medium-sized. They were all sent to the golem factory, and would be enough to use for a long time. Su Lin looked at the elemental cores in his hand and grinned. His luck was still pretty good with more than a 30% drop rate. Elemental cores were still very mysterious. Sometimes, killing a dozen elemental cores might not necessarily result in one drop, and sometimes, it would continuously drop. However, legendary elemental creatures were bound to drop elemental cores after death. It was just that very few dared to go to the elemental planes to hunt legendary elemental creatures. After all, elemental creatures in the elemental planes would be enhanced and become very difficult to deal with. Moreover, elemental creatures were rare creatures that could be the rulers of high-rank elementals. If one was unlucky, it was very likely that they would be ganged up on by a legendary elemental creature leading a large number of elementals. Chapter 679. Su Lin had never thought of going to the elemental plane to hunt legendary elementals or advanced elementals. Such actions would easily attract the attention of the elemental lords, or even the elemental gods. There were a large number of elemental lords, elemental gods, elemental oracles, and so on living in the elemental plane. Those elemental creatures were basically their people. Although the elemental gods rarely meddled, no one dared to underestimate their influence. It should be known that the elemental gods had directly defeated the demon army in the abyss. If he really provoked them, not to mention the elemental gods, even a few elemental oracles would be able to beat him up. Su Lin was very self-aware. There were quite a lot of creatures living in the elemental plane. For example, in the water elemental plane, there were many sea dragons living there. In the earth elemental plane, there were a large number of gem dragons living there. In the fire elemental plane, there were often red dragons, gold dragons, and magma dragons who liked to stay there. In the wind elemental plane, there were even more. There were wind dragons, winged dragons, and a very rare creature, the feathered serpent god, also lived there. The feathered serpent god was a divine creature. When this creature grew up, its strength was similar to that of a giant dragon. The feathered serpent god looked very similar to the divine dragon in the Hua nation in his previous life, but they had a pair of wings. The feathered serpent god was a descendant of the ancient gods in ancient times. After the end of the ancient gods' era, it lived in seclusion in another world. Now in the material plane, the feathered serpent god was very rare, even rarer than unicorns. However, in some ancient temples, statues of the feathered serpent god were often found. This also showed that the feathered serpent god was very active in ancient times. Similar to the feathered serpent god was the eastern giant eagle, which was also a divine creature. Once in the ancient gods' era, the eastern giant eagle had always followed the sun god. However, after the sun god fell in ancient times, these eastern giant eagles no longer believed in the sun. Later, most of these divine creatures migrated to the wind elemental plane. Perhaps a few eastern giant eagles lived in other material planes. The eastern giant eagles loved to fly towards the sun every morning. However, although the eastern wind god eagle had disappeared from the material plane, their descendants still existed. For example, the Hagen's giant eagle could reach a height of 2.5 to 3 meters, with a wingspan of more than 8 meters. An adult Hagen's giant eagle would have the power of a grade 3 Hagen's giant eagle. A small number of powerful Hagen's giant eagles could reach the pinnacle of grade 3. Many wizard organizations like to sign contracts with these Hagen's giant eagles. These Hagen's giant eagles had the intelligence of a human and were very powerful. After Sulen and Hathaway cleaned up the berserk elementals, they began to repair the remaining spatial cracks. Due to the explosion, in addition to tearing a large number of cracks in the spatial barrier of the demi-plane, the area of the demi-plane had also expanded several times. This was also one of the reasons why Sulen was conducting experiments here. Even if the experiment failed, he could still expand the demi-plane. If the demi-plane was expanded normally, it would take decades or even centuries to expand to its current extent. Now that the elemental furnace had exploded, it saved a lot of time. Although it also caused the demiplane spatial barrier to be severely damaged and polluted, it could still be repaired with some time. The wind was howling. Dimensional storms appeared around Sulen, and the energy barrier on the surface of his body kept flashing. In less than a minute, Sulen's energy barrier had been hit dozens of times. The dimensional storms were raging, and the energy barrier on the surface of Sulen's body quickly dimmed under the continuous attacks. Finally, with a light bang, it completely shattered. However, before this energy barrier was completely shattered, another energy barrier had risen from Sulen's body. The spatial crack in front of them was severely damaged. The huge crack was fragmented by the explosion, and there were a lot of spatial fragments around it. These spatial fragments were shaken by the dimensional storms. In the demi-plane, the ground nearby had collapsed into countless boulders. Because of the severe spatial cracks, the gravity here had become very unstable. No, it should be said that it was chaotic. The gravity in some places had increased by several times, but in some places, the gravity on the ground had completely disappeared. In some places, the gravity was entangled with each other and spread in all directions. The spatial barrier here was severely damaged. In the past month or so, this spatial crack showed no signs of recovery. In fact, the spatial crack here was getting bigger and bigger. If no one repaired it, this space would completely shatter. If left alone, the spatial crack would keep expanding, and the entire demi-plane would eventually turn into nothingness. Sulen's body shone brightly, and then, a magic barrier rose from his body and blocked the huge spatial crack in front of him. The power of the dimensional storms in this spatial crack had already reached the 8th circle. It could be said that Sulen was being bombarded by 8th circle spells every minute. Fortunately, Sulen was powerful. He could resist all these spells. A huge boulder flew towards Sulen at an extremely fast speed. Sulen's eyes flashed, and then, lightning flashed in his eyes. The next second, a bolt of lightning appeared out of nowhere and fiercely hit that huge boulder. The boulder, which was the size of a carriage, was instantly torn apart under the bombardment of the lightning. Then, it was sucked into a spatial storm and instantly turned into fine dust, disappearing without a trace. "What is that?" Hathaway suddenly said, pointing not far away. Sulan looked up and saw that in that dark space, the space of the demiplane was continuously shrinking. The other side of the demiplane had already become a chaotic void zone, and the berserk spatial power was continuously eroding the demiplane. This was the demiplane that Sulan had transformed. It was constantly collapsing and had no power to resist the dimensional storms. This spatial crack was very dangerous. "Hathaway, be careful," Sulan said in a deep voice. "Don't worry. You also have to be careful. Leave a spatial coordinate here. If you can't resist it, immediately teleport back," Hathaway said solemnly. Lightning domain. Powerful lightning power instantly gushed out of Sulan's body. The lightning domain instantly opened, and the tyrannical domain power instantly blocked the spatial crack. Those dimensional storms kept attacking the barrier of the lightning domain, but it was useless. These dimensional storms were firmly blocked by Sulan. Next, Hathaway started to quickly arrange a spatial runic array in the surroundings. Chapter 680. It took nearly half a year to repair the half-plane, and another 2 years to clean up the pollution. If it weren't for the high-grade demons, it would have taken even longer. The half-plane was heavily polluted. At first, Sulan and the others used neutralizing powder to purify it, but it wasn't very effective and could only weaken the pollution a little. It wasn't very effective against stubborn pollution. Most of the pollution in the half-plane was like this. In order to clean up the pollution, Hathaway finally used another method, which was to use a large amount of purifying water to wash the half-plane back and forth. This method could quickly dilute the pollution. If it was in a material plane, this method would remove the pollution, but at the same time, it would cause the pollution to spread. However, it was different in a half-plane. The half-plane was a sealed space, and the pollution couldn't spread at all. After using the purifying water, Sulan would directly open a space crack and let the polluted water flow into the void. The void's omnipresent space storm would completely tear the polluted water to shreds. There was no need to worry about the polluted water contaminating other places. The space storm would quickly split the water into molecules or even smaller particles. After a dozen or so cleanses, the Northwind Tower spent a lot of money and finally reduced the pollution to below the standard value. The rest of the pollution could only be slowly recovered with time. In fact, there was a faster way, which was to plant the Wisdom Ancient Tree in the half-plane. The Wisdom Ancient Tree's purification field would completely purify the whole plane. After a few years, the half-plane finally returned to normal. Then, the renovation plan began. This half-plane would be the logistics base of the Northwind Tower. It had been a few years since the last explosion of the elemental fusion furnace. In these years, Hathaway hadn't stopped experimenting with the elemental fusion furnace. Finally, a year ago, the elemental fusion furnace was completely perfected. The elemental fusion furnace wasn't big, but the energy it provided was almost endless. With the elemental fusion furnace, the floating city's energy problem was solved. The renovation work of the northern city had never stopped. In fact, the renovation work was getting faster and faster. This was mainly due to the increasing number of wizard apprentices in the Northwind Academy. These apprentices had completed their transformation from ordinary people to wizard apprentices and began to accept large amounts of missions to earn resources. And the safest and most profitable mission was to modify the floating city. Although the strength of these apprentice adepts was very low, they were still much stronger than the slaves and workers. The transformation work, which was originally quite difficult, began to speed up. At the same time, the water elementium circulation system, life circulation system, air circulation system, and other supporting systems of the floating city were completed under the combined efforts of the adepts. The progress of the entire floating city was quickly completed. By the time the elemental fusion furnace was completed, the main body of the floating city was almost finished. The original puzzle of the Northwind Tower also needed to be modified. The previous puzzle could only cover a range of 500 meters around the Northwind Tower. This kind of puzzle worked well, so Surin, Hathaway, and Alex worked together to upgrade the puzzle. This puzzle was upgraded into a man-made magic net. The man-made magic net relied on the elemental fusion furnace. With the support of powerful energy, this magic net controlled an area of 50 kilometers. This man-made magic net had all the functions of a magic net. After entering the range of the man-made magic net, those without permission would have their spellcasting ability greatly restricted. High-grade wizards would lose their spellcasting ability directly. High-grade wizards would also have their spellcasting ability greatly reduced. Only legendary wizards were basically unaffected. For those with permission, they only needed to use a small part of their power to cast certain spells. Moreover, being in the range of the magic net would also give them a boost in mana recovery. At the same time, they would also receive permanent spells such as Flight, Mage Armor, and Energy Deflection Force Field. These spells would always be there. In addition to the man-made magic net, the ecosystem of the floating city was also almost complete. After the various systems were installed, these systems would activate the ecosystem system. The range of the ecosystem system and the man-made magic net were the same. The ecosystem system would allow the floating city to maintain an environment similar to that of the main material plane in any environment. At the same time, it could block the outside environment from affecting the floating city. With the ecosystem system, the floating city could enter the astral plane. Low-grade wizards and ordinary humans who were not strong enough would not die from extreme environments. In fact, if ordinary people could live in the astral plane for a long time, there were still many benefits. After all, the astral plane was filled with a large amount of source energy. This was the most basic energy in the multiverse. Even if one did not have the aptitude to become a wizard, after removing the source energy for a long time, they would still gain a lot of benefits. During the period of the Arcane Empire, many floating cities would enter the astral plane for a fixed period of time. In addition to collecting materials, another reason was to promote human evolution. After coming into contact with the source energy, the human soul would evolve under the influence of the source energy. These evolved humans would gain psionic abilities. Just like the Githyankis who lived in the astral plane, they were born with psionic talents and could become psionicists. These evolved humans were also called astral humans. If they completely adapted to life in the endless sea of stars and truly became an astral race, then over time, more psionic talents would be injected into their genes. However, if they left the astral plane and returned to the material plane, then this psionic talent would gradually disappear. If they lived in the material plane for too long and did not enter the astral plane, astral humans would also transform back into ordinary humans. Of course, this talent did not completely disappear, but was hidden in their genes. Once they entered the astral plane again, this ability would be reawakened. After several years of hard work, Sullen's floating city finally took shape. After the energy source of the floating city was completed, the next step was to install the most important floating ring of the floating city. Lifting up a city required a very high level of technology. At the same time, it also required a lot of precious materials. Fortunately, the underground world was rich in mineral resources. After accumulating a lot of precious resources over the years and purchasing a lot of materials through trade, this large floating ring was finally built. Chapter 681. Northern Wasteland, Northgard City. Early in the morning, the soldiers of Northern Town appeared on the streets of the city. The residents of Northern Town felt strange. Soon, the inner city was completely under martial law. No one was allowed to get close, and the whole city was in a state of alert. There was a 50-meter barrier between the inner city and the outer city. At the city gate, all caravans were forbidden to enter. At the same time, many people were sent out of the city in batches. Although they were puzzled by the situation, they left with the soldiers. Sullen's control of the whole city was not just for show. The whole city would act as soon as he gave the order. Soon, the evacuation of northern town was completed. Even the original soldiers retreated to the city wall. Accompanied by strong elemental fluctuations, a muffled sound was heard, and the whole ground shook violently. In the Tower of the North Wind, Hathaway was wearing a gorgeous wizard robe and standing on the astrology platform. Next to her were Chris, Alex, Karina, Grace, and the others. On the other side was Sulen. On the astrology platform, a huge amount of elemental energy was constantly gathering toward the wizard tower. The elemental energy in the entire wizard tower was almost condensed. With the strong energy, the energy nodes in the wizard tower were quickly activated, and the energy channels were shining with a faint light. Activate the elemental furnace. Elemental furnace igniting. Igniting complete. Elemental furnace igniting. Floating space tower charging. Safety check in progress, all procedures are operating normally. Floating space ring charging. Main floating space ring activated, main floating space ring operating normally. Prepare to take off. Hathaway was surrounded by strong energy. The originally loose wizard robe was also supported by this energy. Her body floated directly under this strong elemental energy. Hathaway nodded to Sulen. Then, lightning flashed on Sullen's body, and a spiritual light rushed to the sky. The golem army in the wizard tower was busy. Andre, Lorraine, and several other wizards were constantly commanding the golems to work. Magical-looking metal constructs were transported to various locations in the city. Start assembling the floating space city. Prepare to activate the auxiliary floating ring. In other parts of the floating city, the wizards were waiting for orders. After receiving Sullen's order, they said in a serious tone, "The Northwind Tower is ready. It's our turn now. Charge it immediately." With the command of this magus, the energy crystals around them slowly lit up. Surging elemental energy immediately entered, and the runic array on the ground was activated at this moment. In the center of the runic array, the silver-white floating ring also began to flicker with spiritual light. The bottom of the floating city is separating. The underground of Northgard City had long been hollowed out. Back then, the Grey Dwarves had dug out tunnels under Northgard City and connected them with special constructs. It could be said that the floating city was now completely supported by these constructs. On the astrology platform, a three-dimensional virtual image of the entire floating city appeared before everyone's eyes. At this time, below the virtual image of the floating city, there were red dots marked, which were the linked constructs. Begin automaton separation. Sulen said in a deep voice. With his command, the many red dots at the bottom of the floating city began to separate. In just a few breaths, all the linked constructs had completed their separation. The entire floating city shook slightly, then stabilized in an instant. However, a large number of cracks had appeared in the connecting area between the floating city and Northgard City. Many of the edges were already showing signs of collapse. The original inner city of Northgard City was completely broken. Countless rocks slid down, as if the entire ground was about to sink. However, at this moment, a spiritual light rose, followed by a powerful force that enveloped the entire floating city. After shaking slightly, the floating city began to slowly rise, and the speed of the rise was getting faster and faster. In just a few breaths of time, the entire floating city had risen nearly a meter in height. Activate anti-gravity force field. Begin ascension. The surging elemental energy was quickly consumed, and with a strong energy fluctuation, the entire city rose directly under the effect of this force. A large number of rock fragments fell from the floating city, and a foundation made entirely of obsidian was revealed. The edges of the floating city continued to crack, and a large number of rocks fell down, constantly making loud noises. With the rise of the floating city, many empty spaces appeared in the floating city. These empty spaces were naturally elemental constructs that had not been installed yet. After the floating city rose to a certain height, the people who had been waiting at the astrology platform immediately began to work. One by one, the completed components were moved over and then installed in order. With a series of metal clanging sounds, these construct components were linked together one after another. After connecting these magic constructs, the energy channels were also connected. After the energy reached here, these construct components also began to operate. Mud to stone. Dozens of spells rose, and the originally soft ground in the floating city began to quickly transform under the effect of this magic, gradually turning into hard rock. The entire floating city's foundation was fused together under the effect of these spells. Hardening. Hardening. A series of spells flashed from Sullen's body, and the original rock immediately became stronger under the effect of the hardening spell. In just a few breaths, the entire floating city was buffed with a large number of hardening spells. Outside Northern Town City, hundreds of thousands of people were looking at everything in shock. Countless people saw a city the size of a small mountain fly up, and their faces turned ashen. There were also many people who knelt on the ground and cried out that this was a miracle. The city is flying. Unbelievable. Miracle, this is a miracle. Is this a god? There was a burst of exclamations, and the people of the northern city were stunned at this moment. Even the clergy in the northern city were tongue-tied. In their eyes, a city the size of a small mountain flew up from the ground. This was a power that only gods could use. When they saw Sulen perform it, they were greatly shocked. Is this the power of a wizard? A large number of adventurers in the city muttered to themselves. The little red dragon Onyxvia looked at everything in front of her with a shocked face. She naturally knew about the floating city, but she did not expect her master to have built a floating city. In her heart, she was even more in awe of her master. In the sky, a strong storm completely blew away the surrounding clouds, and powerful energy gathered around the city. Chapter 682. Strong elemental energy fluctuations gathered near the floating city, bringing with them strong winds. The floating city floated in the air like a divine kingdom. The elemental fusion furnace kept sending energy out, and the floating city began to operate at full capacity. After Sulen tested most of the functions of the floating city, he began to control the floating city to descend. The floating city shook slightly and landed in its original position. If it weren't for some rock fragments at the edge of the floating city, many people would have suspected that everything was an illusion. The successful construction of the floating city made Sulen and the others very happy. It cost a lot of money to build the floating city, and now it was finally completed. Sulen didn't hide his testing this time, showing off his muscles. After the floating city's test was completed, most of the forces on the continent knew immediately. Their attitude toward Northwind Tower naturally needed to be adjusted. Northwind Principality. After a few years of development, it had become very prosperous. Although there were only 4 cities in the principality, the total population had reached an astonishing 1.5 million. Deepwater City was the most populous city. This port city had become very prosperous because of the sea trade. The permanent population of the city had exceeded 500,000, and several small towns had appeared around the city. Most of the people living in these small towns were craftsmen. The prosperity of the sea trade caused an endless stream of merchants to come here. Some clever merchants began to set up some workshops near Deepwater City to produce all kinds of goods. Although the goods in Northwind City were good, they were limited. There were too many merchants who came to buy, and every time, the supply couldn't meet the demand. After many merchant ships came here, they couldn't buy enough goods to fill the cargo ships. For merchants, a voyage without a full cargo was a loss. Therefore, many merchants who couldn't buy enough goods from Northwind City would buy other goods in Deepwater City. Although these goods were far less popular than those in Northwind City and the profits were lower, it was better than nothing. Among them, the most popular was refined salt, a specialty of Deepwater City. Deepwater City produced a light yellow refined salt without any bitterness. The quality was much better than rock salt mixed with a lot of impurities. Although it wasn't as good as blue salt, it was still very good. As a result, Deepwater City became even more prosperous. In addition, Deepwater City also produced a variety of dried seafood. The sea area near Deepwater City happened to be at the intersection of the cold north wind current and the warm south current. Two ocean currents converged here, bringing rich nutrients. A large number of fish thrived here, and any fishing boat could fill it up after a few trips. Deepwater City's fishery was rich in sturgeon. This kind of fish meat was fat and tender and was very popular. In addition, Deepwater City was rich in salt, so a large number of sturgeon would be pickled and sold as salted fish. Although dried salted fish didn't taste as good as freshly caught fish, it was salted. Salt was indispensable for anyone. Plus, it wasn't expensive. Moreover, salted fish was a type of meat, which was a very good food for commoners. Therefore, the salted fish from Deepwater City quickly became popular in the Southern Sea region. Even Beifeng Principality had a large number of salted fish for sale. The population of Mirror Lake City in the Southern Sea region wasn't inferior to Northgard City in the slightest. Moreover, relying on Mirror Lake next to it, millions of mu of fertile land had been cultivated here. It could be said that this place had become another large granary in a few years. Since the construction of the floating city in Northgard City was completed, more and more people wanted to live in Northgard City. However, it wasn't as easy as it was a few years ago. The City Hall of Northgard City had greatly increased the requirements. If it weren't for this, the population of Northgard City would have broken through the million mark long ago. The floating city's appearance made Northgard City the focus of the entire continent. Northgard City also had a new name, Magic City. Northgard City, as the capital of Beifeng Principality, had become unprecedentedly prosperous. In the sky, a group of winged dragon knights flew quickly. This was the winged dragon guard of Northgard City. Every winged dragon knight was at the peak of the 4th rank. On the wide and orderly streets, a large number of clay golems and rock golems were at work. Occasionally, a few steel golems would appear. The steel golems didn't look clumsy. Instead, their bodies were slender and graceful. They had humanoid faces. Their surfaces had a silvery white metallic luster, and there were many golden red patterns on them. The steel golems' foreheads were embedded with blue gems. Complex and precise runes were engraved on them. Their bodies moved nimbly, full of a sense of technology. These steel golems had been optimized and upgraded. Not only did they have powerful physical attacks, but they also had energy attacks. Apart from the fact that they couldn't fly, they were almost identical to Iron Man Floating City. This place, which was known as the capital of magic, looked like a fantasy city. In the Adept Tower, translucent magic bridges appeared out of thin air. These magic bridges were completely made of pure light, forming a closed loop around the Adept Tower. On these closed loops were strange purple magic crystals. At this time, these magic crystals were orbiting around the Adept Tower according to a specific pattern. Rich elemental energy filled the entire floating city. Next to the Adept Tower was a huge garden. When the breeze blew, the lush magic plants swayed slightly. A strong floral fragrance assaulted one's nose. This was the arcane garden Su Len had built in the past. There were fountains, fake mountains, exotic flowers, and all sorts of other things. Around the Adept's Tower, other buildings were scattered all over the place. Energy channels connected these buildings with the Adept's Tower. Countless runes combined to form arcane chains that shrouded the entire floating city, forming an extremely intricate and complicated net. Enigma matrix, man-made weave. Many of the wonders combined with the floating city to form a powerful floating city. Many adepts who had been here called this place an arcane wonder. The whole city was very clean and tidy. It was completely built with obsidian. There were flower beds on both sides of the city. The architectural style was ancient, but also had some magical architectural styles. There were even some sci-fi styles from the previous world. On the other side of the city, 3 artificial lakes the size of a football field appeared in front of them. These artificial lakes were the water circulation system of the floating city. Under the effect of the runes, the sewage was purified and reappeared here. Above the 3 artificial lakes, spatial runes shrouded the area. Inside was the original secret realm around the northern citadel. Sulen and Hathaway spent a lot of effort to connect this secret realm to the floating city. P.S. Thank you, dear readers, for your love and support. This book is about to come to an end. Chapter 683. The northern town Mysterious Plain was connected to the floating city, and the Mysterious Plain was divided into a few areas. Xanthi was in charge of the botanical garden, and the wisdom tree was planted there. With the wisdom tree, the entire botanical garden was covered in a layer of plants. All the plants could grow here. At the same time, the amethyst bees were also multiplying in the garden, and there was a lot of amethyst honey produced every month. The amethyst honey had become an important resource for the northern wind tower. As the wisdom tree grew, a pool of spring water appeared around it. It was the vitality spring water. The vitality spring was the initial form of the fountain of youth. As time passed, the wisdom tree would grow stronger, and the quality of the vitality spring would increase. When the wisdom tree grew into an ancient tree, the vitality spring would become the fountain of youth. Of course, this was not the end. The ancient tree would continue to grow. When it evolved into a tree of life, it would produce the fountain of life. Not only could it increase one's lifespan by 1,000 years, but it could also strengthen one's body. Every time such a treasure appeared, people would fight over it. With the wisdom tree, the taste of some of the magic fruits in the botanical garden had also improved. It could be said that the wisdom tree had directly improved the environment and production of magic fruits in the botanical garden by a large margin. The other part of the mysterious plain was the ecological garden. The ecological garden was very large. After all, it had completely merged with another mysterious plain. Sulen and Hathaway had paid a great price to merge the mysterious plain that sealed the abomination. They had also modified the wizard tower, which became the control center of the ecological garden. This adept tower could adjust the environment and climate of the ecological garden. It could monitor the entire ecological garden at any time and place. A large number of creatures were kept in captivity in the ecological garden, including dinosaurs, wyverns, violent beasts, magical beasts, radiation aberrations, and so on. There were dozens of species and hundreds of different creatures. The floating city already had its first batch of residents. They were the wizards from the Northern Wind Academy. The floating city was designed to accommodate 50,000 to 100,000 people. Sulen planned to take his time to choose. Of course, in addition to the ordinary people, he also had to bring his kin, such as Durgar, drows, half-elves, centaurs, and other races. After all, the total population of these races was not large. On the other side of the floating city, there was a magnificent marble palace, and there was a tall triumphal arch in the square in front of the palace. There were many reliefs carved on the triumphal arch, and there were also many statues in front of the palace behind it. These statues had a power similar to divine power. This was the power of faith, which was different from divine power. The power of faith was a very pure power, and standing nearby, one could feel the unyielding faith. These statues were the statues of all the people who had sacrificed themselves since the founding of the city. The stronger ones were at the third or fourth stage, while the weaker ones were only at the first stage. This was a place where only the brave martyrs could enter. There weren't many statues in the hall at the moment, so the heroic spirits that entered would be revived in the martyr's palace. The strength of a heroic spirit was related to the amount of power of faith. This was one of the reasons why Su Len had to recruit so many ordinary people. Another reason was to increase the number of newborns with adept potential. There was an arcane garden in the floating city. The arcane garden had a special property that could increase the percentage of newborns with adept potential. If it weren't for the fact that the floating city could only hold a limited number of people, Su Len would have wanted to hold hundreds of thousands of people. In a few years, the floating city would have a large number of newborns with wizard potential, which would be very helpful in increasing the overall strength of the floating city. Above the square, a dazzling ball of light floated in the air. It was a golden sun. Of course, it was not a real sun, but an artificial one. It was a legendary magic creation, made by Hathaway using a large number of rare materials and a star core. This artificial sun was emitting a golden halo, surrounded by a circle of golden runes. The sun was not dazzling, but it was very gentle. However, no one dared to underestimate this sun. There was a huge amount of energy sealed in this sun that made one's heart palpitate. If all of it was released, it would not be any weaker than an elemental fusion furnace explosion. Corona, elemental fusion star core, legendary creation. Behind this sun was a hidden space, in which there was a silver plate-like moon. At this time, the moon did not appear in this space, but was hidden. Moonstar, Eye of the Weave, legendary creation. The Moonstar was connected to the Weave, which was a very important energy hub. The Corona was also connected to the man-made Weave, and the two artificial stars could borrow the power of the Weave. There were also hundreds and thousands of light spots of various sizes hidden in the sky. These light spots only lit up at night, and were the stars of the floating city. These stars were actually all nodes of the man-made Weave. The Weave was crisscrossed with a large number of energy nodes. These energy nodes had been transformed into stars by Hathaway, and together with the Corona and Moonstar, they formed the sky of the floating city. This sky was not for show, but was a battle system of the floating city. The Corona and Moonstar revolved around each other, which could mobilize the power of the Weave. The Weave was originally upgraded with the Enigma, so naturally it also had the power of the Enigma. These suns, moons, and stars were the means of attack of the man-made Weave. Countless stars, suns, and moons formed an extremely complex network. It was like an incomparably intricate runic array. Under the control of the astrology platform, it could attack the outside world with the power of a level 10 spell. After continuous optimization, this man-made Weave's attack power could reach the level of level 11 at most. Of course, in addition to attacking, this system was also a huge defensive construct. All kinds of energy linked together, and after activation, it could envelop the entire city. The defensive power of the energy barrier was very strong, and it could withstand a full-strength attack of the floating city. In fact, the floating city's defensive power was weaker than its offensive power. This could not be helped. Current magical research and technological research had not found a sufficiently strong defensive measure. Therefore, the main body of the floating city was extremely hard. All the buildings were made of obsidian, which had high magic resistance and strong physical defense. At the same time, the obsidian was hardened. After this operation, the main body of the floating city was strong enough to withstand an attack of that level. Chapter 684. The Duchy of Beifeng became more and more prosperous. The large influx of people allowed the Duchy of Beifeng to obtain sufficient labor force. Millions of acres of farmland had been cultivated. This allowed Beifeng City to obtain a large amount of raw materials. The deepwater port had become the busiest port in Beifeng City, and it was also the port with the largest population. During this period, many churches had come to test him from all directions. As Sullen's strength increased, he had attracted the attention of the gods. After seeing the powerful divine power in Sulen, these gods thought that Sulen was planning to become a god, and the Duchy of Beifong was likely to be his future church. Sulen directly responded to these hints. After all, he did not plan to become a god. He did not seek a clergy or godhood. Compared to becoming a god, Sulen preferred his current life. Gods did not only have power, but also represented a kind of responsibility. At the same time, if Sulen became a god, he could not travel freely. The arrival of the elemental tide had changed the entire world. The most obvious change was that the difficulty of breaking through to the legendary level had decreased. Originally, there were only 3 legendary level powerhouses in a kingdom, and the most was 5. However, in the past few years, the Kingdom of Florence had 4 new legendary level powerhouses. These newly promoted legendary masters originally wanted to redivide the Kingdom of Florence. In the end, Sulen personally went to talk to these people about life and ideals. Su Luan convinced them with reason and successfully interrupted them. He crossed out the word ba, which moved these people and made them fully realize their mistakes. After feeling Sullen's sincerity, these legendary masters took the initiative to express that the current situation was very good. They would absolutely support the rule of His Majesty Sulen and Her Majesty Queen Phyllis. Having a duchy and a kingdom was enough to support Sullen's floating city. The surging elemental energy quickly gathered, and the whole floating city rose again. After some repairs, Sulen and Hathaway controlled the floating city to rise again. Their goal this time was to head to the astral boundary. Bringing the entire floating space city into the astral plane consumed an astonishing amount of energy. The elemental fusion furnace was operating at full capacity, and an unimaginable amount of elemental energy gushed out. A large amount of elemental energy was consumed, and even the elemental energy in the surrounding space was extracted in large quantities. A small elemental tide appeared here. On the astrology platform, a dazzling spiritual light shot up into the sky. The spiritual light tore through the sky, and a powerful soul fluctuation was transmitted. A giant portal appeared, and then the huge floating city entered it. In the boundless astral world, darkness, deathly stillness, and emptiness were the eternal colors of this place. Occasionally, 1 or 2 comets would fly past at high speed. There was very little matter here. There was no air, no gravity, no water, and not even a sound. Everything was deathly still. At this moment, in the depths of the astral world, a dot of starlight flashed. Then, a huge bubble suddenly appeared in the void. If someone saw it, they would know that someone was traveling through space. The bubble expanded rapidly, and in the blink of an eye, it had expanded by more than 10 times. Soon, the outline of a city appeared in the bubble. Accompanied by a flash of spiritual light, the bubble slowly disappeared, and a huge city appeared in front of them. It was Sullen's floating space city. Although this floating space city was very large in the material plane, it was as inconspicuous as a speck of dust in the astral world. Is this the astral world? Alex, who had come to the astral world for the first time, looked outside curiously. It's not that great. It doesn't feel as beautiful as the material plane. But there's so much source energy here. I feel like my spellcasting ability has directly increased by a level. That's natural. Source energy can be directly integrated into the soul, Sulen explained. It's good, but it's too dark around here. Alex said. Sulen smiled slightly. The astral world has always been like this. Don't think that the astral world is empty, dark, and deathly still. There are still many creatures living in the astral world, such as the astral whale, Githian, evil god, abomination, or other astral world travelers. It's still very dangerous here. Many ancient dragons that can't live in the prime material plane will also move their lairs to the astral world. In addition, there are spacetime storms, spatial cracks, and so on. So, be careful in the astral world, Su Len said to them. Hathaway stood on the astrology platform and observed the surrounding astral world through the large star finder on the astrology platform. This thing was specially built by Hathaway for the floating space city to travel in the astral world. The star finder could observe all kinds of energy and matter in the astral world. It could be used for warning and detection, and at the same time, it could be used to find planes. Next to the star finder was a three-dimensional virtual imaging system, and on it was a star map of the astral world around the floating space city. This star map had just been created, and there was only the surrounding information. As a newbie who had just entered the astral world, there was no star map, so they could only draw it themselves. Su Len was now a little regretful that he didn't meet an astral merchant and buy a star map from them. As merchants who traveled in various planes all year round, astral merchants had the most accurate star maps. Although it was impossible for them to take out the most accurate star maps to trade, it was much better to have a rough star map than now. Hathaway kept using the star finder to observe the astral world and recorded the coordinates of the astral world on the star map. Next to the star map, a bright spot appeared, which was the newly recorded coordinates of the astral world. Astral world travel often used astral world coordinates for ultra-long-distance teleportation. Because of the scarcity of materials in the astral world, it was very easy to use teleportation spells. With the help of astral world coordinates, it was easy to use teleportation spells and cross hundreds of millions of kilometers in a very short time. There were even special stargates that could teleport even further. After entering the astral world, the entire floating space city was in a closed state. A powerful energy barrier enveloped the entire floating space city. In order to make the people in the city live closer to the material plane, this barrier would show the scene of the sky. Of course, this was all an illusion. The original corona and the lunar star also represented the sun and the moon, respectively. With them, the entire floating space city had a day and night division, and the living environment was very similar to the main material plane. Now that the floating space city is completed, there's nothing important to do next. After a while, let's go to the surrounding star region. Su Len said with a smile. That's for sure. I also want to go to other material planes to have a look. Maybe I can find some things left by the Arcane Kingdom, Hathaway said. Then our next goal is to find the Arcane Kingdom. Su Len said aloud. Agreed. End of the book. You're tuning in to the Unparalleled SwordWill YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.